Good morning. Thank you all very much for being here with us this morning. The Center for Civic Engagement, along with the Hofstra Cultural Center, the Office of Intercultural Engagement and Inclusion, the Center for Race and Social Justice, the Rabinowitz Honors College, and the Latin American and Caribbean Studies Program, is very pleased to be sponsoring today's program of events focused on Indigenous Peoples Day. My name is Philip Dalton, and I am the director of the Center for Civic Engagement here at Hofstra University, and I'm also a faculty member of the Rhetoric and Public Advocacy program here. A central part of the Center for Civic Engagement's mission is to foster conversations and dialogues about important national and international issues, and the degree to which the cultures and lives of indigenous peoples of the Americas, and particularly within the United States, have been negatively affected by the arrival of European colonizers can't be questioned. Reclaiming Columbus Day as Indigenous Peoples Day makes this holiday a site of symbolic struggle that should draw our attention to real and important material inequities. At the same time, it can't be forgotten that this day is a day for many to celebrate Italian American heritage, a community that has itself experienced in the United States its own history of prejudice and discrimination. As with any controversy, it's just not that simple. This morning's opening event, Why Not Columbus? The problem with commemorating Indigenous Peoples Day and Italian American heritage on October 12th, is intended to consider and invite conversation about the complexities of this holiday. And to that end, we're very glad that you're here with us this morning. And while we are this morning indebted to many people, it gives me pleasure to recognize Hofstra's Vice Dean of the Lawrence Herbert School of Communication, Murillo. The time and effort that Professor Murillo has devoted to planning today's events is a testament to his devotion to helping address the many problems that indigenous peoples face throughout the world. We're having these conversations today because of him. And in fact, we've had these conversations over the past several years at Hofstra because of his work and because of his vision. So allow me now to introduce Professor Murillo, who will introduce this morning's panel.
Thank you, Phil. Very generous comments. Indeed, there's a lot of people involved in all of this. But it is, I guess, because I've been dealing with this for, I even joined this train, if you will, late, 30 years ago. The issue around renaming Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. But I guess because I've been doing it for so long, Phil, you made those thoughts that it's my doing, but it's a lot of people who are involved. Certainly the Center for Civic Engagement, obviously the idea of naming or changing or recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day opens up the opportunity for lots of different levels of activism. And since the Center for Civic Engagement, that's what it ultimately, its goal is to do that, is to give students the opportunity to engage in the community and to get involved in policymaking, get involved in different areas of civic engagement, whether it's environmental, social justice, human rights work, peace and justice work. In many ways, Indigenous Peoples Day opens up that opportunity in many different fronts, and I'll explain that in a second. This is the third annual Indigenous Peoples Day here at Hofstra, so hopefully we will be able to keep it going in the foreseeable future. I want to thank a lot of people. There's a big list, and Dr. Dalton did mention these different organizations on campus. It's just great to be part of a campus where all these things are happening. Last week alone, there were so many great people and presenters. It's unbelievable, the community of public intellectuals and activists and scholars that makes me really proud to be part of Hofstra University. And one person, again, there's a lot of people to recognize, but I did want to acknowledge all the folks at the Cultural Center, because it seems like all of these big events and all these great people that come to campus are the direct result of the work of the Cultural Center, and especially Ethelene Collins, who is probably the biggest mover and shaker on these events across campus for many, many years. So I wanted to recognize Ethelene, even though she's playing like she's not hearing, but I want to thank you for all the work you do, always. Now it says, that generally when we do events related to indigenous communities, it's important to start it all off by recognizing the territory that we're in. I am not indigenous. I come from the origins of my families. They come from the conquistadores. So I don't consider myself indigenous. Although one would think there's some blood running in my veins that comes from the Taino and or the Chibcha communities of Latin America, of the Caribbean. But I think it's important to recognize those who did and still walk this territory. Here on Long Island, probably you maybe heard this before, the name, and I probably will butcher it, Sawanhaki, Wampanomo, and Paumanake are the names that Long Island used to be called before Predator came, using Ward Churchill's language. And it's important to recognize, and you've probably seen the names all over the highways and in towns, etc., that you may not have realized are indeed the names of nations that lived on this territory 500 plus years ago and even sooner, and still live, in fact, in many areas. The Canarsie, the Rockaway, the Matinacock and the Merricks, Massapequas and the Nissecogs, the Secatogs and the Setaukets, the Korchogs and the Patchogs, the Shinnecock, the Manhasset, and the Montauk. And we should recognize that this is sacred territory, indigenous territory, and I think it's important to point that out as we start the proceedings today. So just moving quickly, I'm going to try to be brief, although it's hard to be brief with some of these stories that we're going to be talking about today with two brilliant colleagues. I'm really happy to be joined by Dr. Trasiati and Dr. Sampedro on this session. We gave the subtitle of today's event, First Nations, National Memory and the Construction of a Collective Narrative in the Americas. Some of you may have heard that on Friday, President Joseph Biden, for the first time a U.S. president, recognized Indigenous Peoples Day officially. He said in his proclamation, he wrote, "For generations, federal policies systematically sought to assimilate and displace Native people and eradicate Native cultures." That's again from his proclamation. He says, "Today we recognize Indigenous peoples' resilience and strength, as well as the immeasurable positive impact that they have made on every aspect of American society." Right? He also, to his credit, re-recognized and signed the protection for 1.3 million acres of territory in Utah, the so-called Bears Ears National Monument was kind of gutted under the Trump administration, and Biden signed as part of his proclamation recognizing that territory as well. So there's some steps forward in terms of recognizing indigenous territory, indigenous rights from this president, from the White House, but it is clearly not enough, or at least a lot of people are arguing that it is not enough, because the idea of recognizing Indigenous Peoples Day is not about symbolism. It's not about words just calling something different, right? And it's hard to, and for a lot of people it's hard, and there's a lot of documentation, literature on it that says it's not enough to even recognize Indigenous Peoples Day but still celebrate and still bring to the top the name Columbus Day, right? And as it's strange, 2 years ago, when we did the first Indigenous Peoples Day, News 12 Long Island, they sent a reporter here, the cable news channel, they were doing a story about Indigenous Peoples Day, but they were really doing it within the context of this battle between Italian Americans and people who were fighting to rename it, right? And so the reporter asked me, and I made the mistake, I should know better to kind of think in sound bites, but sometimes I think more like an academic, and then I don't talk in sound bites, and it becomes a problem for news reporters. But the question that she asked, the first question she asked, she says, "Don't you think calling it Indigenous Peoples Day is not an affront to Italian Americans? Aren't you like challenging the long tradition of great achievements of Italian Americans?" I said, well, first of all, if I'm going to recognize Italian Americans' achievements, I'm certainly not going to point to Columbus as the person who we should celebrate, right? And I'm not going to talk about that. I think Dr. Trasiati has plenty to say about that. But so I said, that's not the case. And it points back to this idea that calling it Indigenous Peoples Day, you're going to confine it to the narrow prism of today's so-called culture wars or cancel culture. In fact, the USA Today had a report last week, and I'll just read quickly from it. Facing 400 Italian Americans and other protesters enraged by a school calendar wiped clean of named holidays, a New Jersey school board voted Monday to return its original school calendar, including a day off marked for Columbus Day. Again, this is from USA Today. Prior to the vote, the Randolph Township Board of Education endured an hours-long public session where citizens demanded board resignations and accused the school officials of pandering to cancel culture activism. That's from the USA Today, right? So it's that divisiveness, right? That it's about, okay, we're canceling Italian-American contributions to American society. We're trying to rename it, or fake history or whatever. And in many ways, it's really frustrating, especially for those of us who've been doing this for a long time. I mean, and again, I joined this struggle 30 years ago, or more than 30 years ago. I remember protesting in front of the Museum of Natural History in 1991, denouncing the statue of Teddy Roosevelt, with on the one side an African and on the other side a native person, as a celebration of American culture. And there was a lot of protests around that, both from the black community, from the indigenous community, from many other sectors. That was more than 30 years ago. I think finally, if I'm not mistaken, they recently took it down, and that was part of the recent struggles around monuments and everything. But it's not something new. It's not part of this new trend. It's been going on and in fact, I started late. Because if we look at it, the first discussions around changing, or at least recognizing that celebrating Columbus and Columbus Day really started back in 1977, but we could say it started 529 years ago, really. Let's be honest. But in terms of movement building, in 1977, there was a big summit at the United Nations in Geneva, where they were addressing issues of indigenous rights globally, not only in the Americas, but all over the world, where indigenous communities have lost land, have been displaced, have been forcibly, have been massacred, have been brought into concentration camps, have been deliberately poisoned, where their lands have been stolen, where their territories have been used for extraction. And part of the discussion that was being had back then in 1977 was to draw attention to the many other factors that lead to this kind of ongoing cultural, political, social genocide that it started with Columbus, but it never finished. And one of the points that they made is that we as native communities, indigenous communities, we cannot move forward if you don't recognize those sins of the past, if you don't document and clearly point it out. And one of the things that they pointed to was the idea of celebrating Columbus. And they were anticipating, this is 1977, so they were anticipating 15 years ahead when the whole world was going to celebrate and commemorate 500 years of the discovery of America, right? 1992, there was a lot of mobilization around that. And they made that point back in 77, and they were struggling on all different fronts. Finally, in 1991, the City Council of Berkeley, California. Anybody here from Berkeley or from California? Well, they were the first municipality to actually recognize, and they didn't call it Indigenous Peoples Day. They called it, I forget what they called it. They called it something else, similar to Indigenous Peoples Day, but a recognition of Native America, right? And then from there, 1992 came, a lot of actions. I remember we were doing all sorts of different teach-ins, screenings, actions all around the country and all around the Americas, for that matter. In Latin America, it was happening to denounce the celebration of the Colombian experiment, right, of this process of extraction that started way, way long ago. So it's, and the point that is made again and again by organizers and activists who are involved in this, again, to say that a superficial renaming of Columbus Day or recognizing it doesn't necessarily solve the issues that they're addressing, because the movement for indigenous rights, the movement for rethinking the Columbus Day to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day is a movement in defense of human rights, right? Calling attention to the atrocities and to the violence and to the ongoing, this is not old, this is continuing today, every day, in many countries, including right here in the United States of America. Defense of human rights. It's a political movement for representation, to get representation, political representation at every level of government, right? Everybody's celebrating Deb Haaland, who's the first Interior Secretary, the first cabinet minister, I think, ever Indigenous Native American in I think in history. I may be wrong, but I think she's the first one. So we celebrate that. That's a minor step forward. But also in elected government positions, et cetera, ongoing movements. And again, this is a continental, north-south, entire continental movement. An environmental movement, right? We're not going to deny that, because the people who are at the front lines of environmental degradation, of corporate capital extraction going into territories for mining, for oil, for water, the most sacred thing that we have on this planet, water, being controlled by outsiders, going into territories that are being terrorized and destroyed, is an environmental movement, right? So, you know, all the mobilizing about green energy and about trying to protect the environment, the heart of it is an indigenous territory, right? So it's an environmental movement, it's a social justice movement, it's a women's rights movement, right? I mean, how many of you knew this? I mean, some of you may. I know many of you are alert and paying close attention to a lot of things. As of 2016, the National Crime Information Center has reported 5,712 cases of missing American Indian and Alaska Native women and girls. How many of you knew that? I mean, some of you probably did, right? But we heard about, and this is nothing, I mean, we're not about to put a hierarchy of pain and suffering, but we heard nonstop the last couple of weeks about one young woman who was unfortunately disappeared, right? And we hear it constantly in the news. This is horrific, this is an atrocity. Well, to me, since 2016, 5,700 people, women, girls, disappeared, killed, murdered, generally at the hands of non-native, non-indigenous people. That to me is a national atrocity that needs to be addressed. Indigenous Peoples Day, the movement to recognize Indigenous Peoples Day, is trying to call attention to that atrocity, right, or those atrocities, right? So the idea to topple monuments, yes, that's symbolic, and it's important, and it's happening everywhere, you know, in Colombia, in Chile, in Guatemala, here in the United States. It's happening everywhere, right? And that's important. Those are symbols of terror and symbols of false memory and myths, which my colleagues are going to talk about now. But it goes way beyond that. It goes way beyond that. It's important to understand that, right? It's really, and the pushback is pretty strong, right? The pushback against Indigenous Peoples Day, just like the pushback against critical race theory and teaching anything about what really built this country, how this country actually came about, is really profound, right? We know that it's not just, you know, a few people who, you know, a few naysayers, right? Very powerful people are in the process of negating that history, right? We know, I won't mention the name, this is the name that can't be mentioned, but just from the Republican National Circus of August of last year, where the keynote speaker said, quote, "Our American ancestors sailed across the perilous ocean to build a new life on a new continent. They braved the freezing winters, crossed the raging rivers, scaled the rocky peaks, trekked the dangerous forests, and worked from dawn till dusk. These pioneers didn't have money, they didn't have fame, but they had each other. They loved their families, they loved their country, they loved their God. When opportunity beckoned, they picked up their Bibles, packed up their belongings, climbed into their covered wagons, and set out west for the next adventure," right? I don't have to mention who said that, but that's the mindset of not only the person who said it, but a big chunk of the population that supports that kind of thinking, right? So again, renaming Indigenous people, Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day is not just about a name. It's not just about a day in history. It's not just about, you know, recognizing it for 24 hours and then we're done. That contestation has to be constant, and again, it goes back to the activism that Center for Civic Engagement tries to nourish and tries to encourage and tries to push with all its work that it does on campus and off campus. Glenn Cantave, who came last week, one of the many great speakers who were here last week, the CEO and founder of the Movers and Shakers virtual reality activism. They do monuments, virtual monuments with virtual reality to contest that Colombian type of stuff. He reminded us the other day, which I'm sure you've heard before, we must never forget that the alteration of history is a war tactic, right? And usually by the winners, or the ones who are perceived to be the winners. And I go to Charles Blow, the New York Times columnist who was here. He gave the inaugural speech the other day here on campus. He said, referring to this battle over critical race theory and denying history by many sectors powerful sectors in the US. He says, how do you heal a society when you ignore gaping wounds? How do you heal a society when you ignore gaping wounds? And it reminded me the other day, I was talking to Tiokasin Ghost Horse, a good friend, a Lakota elder who's going to be joining us in a few hours in a 420 session, which I hope you can join us virtually. It's a great session. He describes himself as a survivor of the Christian boarding schools that tortured, killed, disappeared hundreds, if not thousands of Native children, not only in Canada, which we heard some news about last year and earlier this year, but also here in the US. And he describes, and he was telling me the other day on the phone, that his community, the Cheyenne Lakota, he said that they have a healing ceremony which they call wiping the tears, where through collective storytelling, where through reflection, they harness the energy of those who are past, those people who are in the past, who they've lost, who've suffered through trauma, etc. And that's the way to build a better future and to heal through that trauma, right? And that he says through these real stories we begin the healing process. And he talked about how the reason why he does radio, he's a radio host also, he does a national radio show on about 150 stations. He says is that for me it's a healing process, right? I'm talking to people and hearing their stories. But when you have a large chunk of the population trying to squash any attempt of telling those stories, when you're negating those stories even exists, where it's not even a part of the discussion, and you're actually encouraging your students who are going to school not to hear those stories. I mean, it's a twisted logic. That's what we're trying to do, put a little grain of sand in the work that we're doing with CCE, with today's event, in trying to bring some of these voices together to talk about Indigenous Peoples Day. And again, it's not something new. So forgive me for my long-winded introduction, but I felt it was important to contextualize the whole idea of Indigenous Peoples Day. And then now I can welcome my colleagues who are going to speak. And the idea, why not Columbus? The problem with commemorating Indigenous Peoples Day and Italian-American heritage on October 12th. Some people are saying we should do both, right? And some people say, wait, that's an inherent contradiction, right? To celebrate both on the same day. So we're going to talk about it from a number of perspectives. Dr. Benita Sampedro Vizcaya, she's a professor of Spanish colonial studies. I believe some of you have probably had her in the class. She's the Dorothy and Arthur Engle Distinguished Professor in Literature at Hofstra University. Her research engages academically and politically with Spanish colonial pasts and presents, archives and legacies, both in North and Sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean. She's invested in the study of colonial links within and beyond the frame of the multiple Spanish imperial Atlantic and global networks, and has published widely on the politics and processes of decolonization, colonial medicine, colonial domestic labor, the colonial politics of meteorology, colonial carceral systems, border mobility, and on the ruins of late colonial modernity. So she's going to talk a little bit about the history of Columbus, place Columbus in its historical context, and debunk a few of the myths about the historical figure and the way it's typically depicted both in media and also obviously in schools and in popular culture. And then after we hear from Dr. Sampedro, we're going to hear from Dr. Marianne Traciati. She's a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy and director of labor studies at Hofstra, right here, of course. She's also president of Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition, keeping history alive. It's a living history. She is also president of Remember the Triangle Fire Coalition. She teaches, researches, speaks, and writes about women in the labor movement, public memory and commemoration, social protest, and public space. For the past decade, she has been leading the project to build a memorial to the 146 workers, mostly Italian and Jewish immigrant women and girls, who died in the 1911 Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City. Scheduled for dedication in 2022, the Triangle Memorial will be New York City's first labor memorial and one of only a small number of memorials in the city dedicated to women. So Dr. Traciati, she'll explain Columbus as an American symbol, as a US symbol, how and why he became important for Italian immigrants, and why the descendants of those immigrants should let him go. And so she's going to lead that discussion. But so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Benita Sampedro to today's session. Welcome.
Carol, do you think you can come to reinstate the PowerPoint? Thank you, everyone. And of course, thank you to the Center for Civic Engagement and to Mario Murillo and all the colleagues that put together this event for inviting me to share with you some of these information about Columbus and the history of Columbus and America that we regularly also teach in our Spanish classes and our Latin American and Caribbean studies classes. So what I will do in this 15-minute presentation or so is to start a little bit further back in 1470s, more or less, and try to place Christopher Columbus in its historical context, also not as an isolated figure, but as a conglomerate, right, of events and circumstances and people related to this crossing of the ocean sea, right, in 1492. And I will bring up the figure all the way to the year 1500, more or less, when Christopher Columbus fell in discredit and then fell into oblivion for the next 300 years until his historical figure was kind of resurrected at the beginning of the 19th century. And I will end the presentation with basically explaining why the problems with celebrating Columbus Day and what are some of the complexities, also some of the challenges, some of the things that we need to readdress or revisit in terms of linguistic and semantic issues, but also in terms of politics and the way we teach history, the way we perpetuate history, and also some epistemological problems with the whole issue of the discovery, so-called discovery of America. I have a PowerPoint with a few maps and also a few portraits of Columbus to show how his image was perpetuated in public consciousness and the media and the academic system as well. So it is conventionally assumed that Christopher Columbus was born in the Republic of Genoa in 1451, although, of course, his birth certificate was never found, so there is even a question of whether exactly he was born. He was 42 years old when he was granted the contract to sail to Asia by crossing the Atlantic. Some historians claimed that he was the son of a navigator, and so it is quite possible that his upbringing would have been as seafaring expeditions with his father over the Mediterranean and parts of the Atlantic. One of his brothers, Bartolomeo Columbus, became a well-established cartographer in Lisbon during this period. Christopher Columbus spoke Italian, Spanish, and Portuguese, and he wrote in a mixture of all these languages. He left 4 diaries of the 4 trips to the Americas and also a number of letters which were published during his lifetime. He acquired experience at sea with the Portuguese navigators prior to arriving to Castile and resided and worked in Portugal at least for a decade prior to 1492 and was employed by different Portuguese traders exploring the Atlantic coast of Africa and setting up trading posts, which the Portuguese at that time called factorias. Just as an anecdotal element, I will mention here that one of the trading posts that they established was the one of Elmina in Accra, Ghana, in 1482. This was the first trading post built by the Portuguese in the Gulf of Guinea, and later this castle, this trading post, became one of the most important and also infamous stops on the route of the Atlantic slave trading. Columbus was not a scholar. He didn't have a scholarly training, but he read books on astronomy, geography, and history, making hundreds of marginal annotations in them, and came out with some ideas about the world. Some of them were wrong, hence the difficulty in securing a contract for his first trip across the Atlantic, despite having tried on his proposal with the Portuguese, the French, and the English courts before reaching out to the Spanish crown. We know that he read, for instance, the travels of Marco Polo, a 13th century travelogue. He also read Pliny's Natural History. Pliny was a Roman author and naturalist of the 1st century BC. And he also read works on astronomy by Ptolemaeus, in which medieval astronomy was largely based. In the early 1480s, the Columbus brothers drafted a plan to reach the Indies by sailing west across the Ocean Sea. The Ocean Sea is how the Atlantic was called before 1492 or before the 1500s. In 1485, they presented this project to the Portuguese crown, and the Portuguese crown rejected it because they considered that the estimated distance was too low and was implausible. In 1488, a new proposal was presented to the Portuguese crown as well, and the Portuguese crown rejected it again because Portuguese navigators were making advances through other routes to reach the markets in Asia. For instance, Bartolomeu Dias, one of the Portuguese traders and navigators, was just returning from circumventing the coast of Africa through the Cape of Good Hope. So there was good hope for the Portuguese that they could find this trading route in a faster and safer way. The Columbus brothers then made attempts to present their proposals to different financiers in Genoa and the Venice republics, but both were unsuccessful again. Columbus's brother, Bartholomeus, then presented their proposal to the King of England, and the King of England also refused it. In 1492, the proposal was finally presented to the Spanish monarchs, well, the Castilian monarchs, Isabel and Ferdinand. It was evaluated by a team of scholars at the University of Salamanca, and these scholars concluded that the calculations that Columbus was presented were really off the chart. And we have here the map on the screen that shows in yellow the actual map as we know it today, and in the shaded area, the map as speculated by Columbus with the distance from Europe and Africa to Asia. In this proposal that the brothers presented to the Spanish crown, Columbus and his brother estimated that the distance from the Canary Islands to Japan to be about 2,300 miles or 3,700 kilometers, when the true figure was actually more like 20,000 kilometers. No ship in the 15th century could have carried enough food and fresh water for such a long journey, and the dangers involved in navigating through the uncharted ocean would have been formidable. The proposal also included wrong geographical misconceptions. He believed that Japan, which he called Cipango, following Marco Polo, was much larger than it actually was. And he also believed that it was farther to the east from China. He called China Cathay. It is also worth pointing out that Columbus's geographical misconceptions continued well after 1492, or his 1492 arrival to the Caribbean. For instance, just to give a few examples, after 4 journeys into the Caribbean, he continued to believe that Cuba was the mainland, meaning a continental mass and not an island. And he also insisted to the last day, in the face of mounting evidence to the contrary, that the lands that he visited during these 4 journeys were part of the Asian continent. Most European navigators reasonably concluded that the westward voyage from Europe to Asia was unfeasible. The Spanish crown, however, having completed an expensive war in the Iberian Peninsula, were eager to obtain a competitive edge over other European countries in the quest for trade. Columbus's project, although far-fetched and unrealistic, held the promise of such an advantage, and they decided to go for it. Though Columbus was wrong about the distance that separated Europe from the Far East, he did have some knowledge on the trading winds, which was pivotal for his successful navigation of the Atlantic Ocean. It allowed him to arrive relatively fast from the Canary Islands to the Bahamas, and therefore his expedition, the first expedition, did not perish at sea. In the April 1992 Capitulaciones de Santa Fe, the leasing contract that Columbus obtained from the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella promised Columbus that if he succeeded in his expedition to establish a trading post in Asia through this other route of the Ocean Sea, now known as the Atlantic, he will be given the rank of Admiral of the Ocean Sea. He will be appointed Viceroy and Governor of all of the new trading posts he could claim for Spain, and he will be entitled to 10% of all of the revenues from these new lands in perpetuity. Between 1492 and 1503, Columbus completed 4 round-trip voyages between Spain and the Americas, all of them under the sponsorship of the Crown of Castile. He also established the first settlement in the Caribbean, the fort called La Isabela, which was located on the northern part, on the coast of the Dominican Republic today. In between 1492 and 1503, he had many failures as well, and many challenges. For instance, one of his boats in the first expedition, the Santa Maria, ran aground and sank on his first trip on the coasts of Haiti, and he had to abandon or leave behind the 35 men on the island, just to discover when he came back on the second journey that none of them survived. There were several mutinies on board, both on the first expedition and also in subsequent expeditions. And there were several mutinies as well on the fort of La Isabela that he established in the Hispaniola, in today's Dominican Republic. And the settlement of La Isabela, which he established, did not survive more than 5 years. So, a little bit about Columbus's discredit. Following his first voyage, Columbus was appointed Viceroy and Governor of the Indies, a position that brought him and his brothers numerous accusations of tyranny and incompetence. They were accused of using torture and mutilation to govern the fort at La Hispaniola. Documents also describe how Columbus put down native unrest and revolt by ordering a brutal crackdown in which many natives were killed, and then parading their dismembered bodies through the streets in an attempt to discourage further rebellion. Columbus had some of his crew members, Spaniards or Europeans, hanged for disobedience. A number of returning settlers and sailors lobbied against Columbus at the Spanish court, accusing him and his brothers of gross mismanagement. Eventually, in the year 1500, Columbus lost royal favor, and the Spanish crown had him removed as governor, arrested, and transported to Spain in chains under accusations of tyranny. At this point, Columbus's career was irreversibly damaged. He was permitted to cross the Atlantic one last time after that, but was not allowed to go back to the Caribbean, and all his titles were removed, the title of Admiral of the Indies and also of Viceroy. Columbus spent the last 6 years of his life in litigations over the benefits that he and his heirs claimed were theirs against the crown and against different other political and financial parties in Europe. There were also external forces and competitions that competed to Columbus's discredit after the year 1500. For instance, by 1494, it was clear already to most Europeans that Columbus had lied and did not find India or Asia by sailing through the west, as his contract assigned him to do. 1499, a Portuguese navigator, Vasco da Gama, returned from his successful trip to India, surrounding Africa. He had consolidated the route of the spices, a trading route with Asia, and it became clear that the Portuguese mariners, the Portuguese navigators, had won this competition. Columbus had again not delivered on his contract. In 1499, a Florentine explorer and businessman, Amerigo Vespucci, landed in the coast of Venezuela. In the year 1500, another Portuguese navigator, Pedro Álvares Cabral, explored the coast of Brazil. And in 1501, 1502, Amerigo Vespucci, sailing on behalf of the Portuguese, demonstrated that both Brazil and the West Indies were indeed not part of Asia. Vespucci's letters were widely published and sold in Europe, as were Columbus's as well. But it so happened that a German printing press in 1507 assigned the name Amerigo Vespucci to, this is the map, assigned the name Amerigo Vespucci to one of the maps that was published at that time. This explains, in part, why the American continent was named after Amerigo Vespucci and not after Columbus. Columbus did not see America named. He died in 1506. He was pretty much forgotten after his death. Upon his death in 1506, the Columbus family, some of his brothers and two of his sons, Hernando and Diego, were involved in endless legal processes and litigations until 1512. But new legal challenges persecuted the family until 1536. And in fact, the litigation continued with many other disputes until the year 1790, that all cases were finally closed. Columbus's name resurfaced 300 years later, actually in the 19th century, partially by North American historians such as Washington Irving, who generated public interest about Columbus with their books within the English-speaking world. Of course, in the first half of the 19th century, we are entering this period of building nation. So Columbus' figure was suitable for that kind of narrative. Some of the myths about Columbus's conception of the world were spread not during his time, but in the 19th century. Washington Irving's 1828 biography of Columbus popularized the idea that Columbus had difficulty obtaining support for his plan because many Catholic theologians insisted that the earth was flat in 1492. Columbus' heroic statue was in fact commented by Washington Irving's freely embellished 1828 bestseller, A History of the Life and Voyages of Christopher Columbus, which launched the popular myth that only Christopher Columbus, by 1492, believed the earth was round and stood as the solitary voice of reason against medieval Catholic Church authorities. The fact is that nearly all educated people in Europe and elsewhere had understood for a long time before 1492 that the earth was round, and so did Columbus. Now, some problems with celebrating Christopher Columbus or Columbus Day. Well, there are many issues, right, with celebrating Christopher Columbus and many problems at different levels. I will just very schematically point out to some of them here, and I am sure they will resurface again at the time of the discussion. Of course, the first I would like to point out are linguistic or semantic issues, right? Semantic issues associated with the whole Columbus's enterprise. The first term that comes to mind is the term discovery, and we should think why the term discovery is not appropriate for this type of enterprise. Discovery for whom? You do not discover something that was already there, right? Or what are the implications of naming this fact a discovery, the political and ideological implications. By the year 1992, with the many celebrations and revisiting of the whole 1492 enterprise, right, under the 500th anniversary, a new term came to be fashionable. The term encounter replaced the term discovery. But the term encounter is also very misleading, because encounter means the encounter between two equal parts. And there were really not two equal parts, right? Exactly, at many instances of this process. Of course, the year 1992 addressed the indigenous questions in many other ways, right? And our colleague Mario Murillo mentioned some of them before, and it is worth mentioning, for instance, just like an isolated event, how the Nobel Peace Prize on that year was granted to Rigoberta Menchú, an indigenous Maya Quiche, right, from Guatemala, in representation of indigenous peoples of the world. So the debate was high, right, in 1992, but many issues in terms of history, in terms of politics and ideology, have not been completely addressed yet. Another term that we need to mention when we talk about 1492 is the term Indian, right? Indian to refer to the native cultures or peoples of the American territory, the Americas, right? Anywhere from Canada to Chile, only perpetuates Columbus's mistake, right? Columbus's erroneous designation of the people he had in front of him. The assumption that that was India, the Caribbean was India, and, or China or Asia, and not the territory that it was. So, of course, there is a need to address that term as well. In most places, in most instances in Latin America, the term Indian and in the Caribbean is replaced today by indigenous or Native American or something of the sort, right? But there are various myths as well that need to be addressed and some epistemological issues. The myth of continents, for instance, as distinctive land masses separated by water, is one of the myths that needs to be assessed in relation to the Columbus enterprise. The standard 7-part continental scheme obscures more than it reveals. There is no clear geographical correspondence to all 7 continents as we study them in school. Think, for instance, of Europe and Asia, right? But also, the division in continents is irrelevant in terms of human geography, right? So this aggrandizing Columbus's enterprise with elevating it to the stature of a continental discovery is also problematic, right? So this continental discovery needs to be scaled down, right? The myth of the great man or the unique few. One of the pervasive myths in history is the myth of the exceptional man. The idea that the so-called discovery was made possible only through the audacity and achievements of a few visionaries needs to be dismantled. We need to assess how historians and others in popular culture, in film, in the educational system, construct myths out of historical figures and historical events of the past, be that Columbus or Vespucci or early navigators, conquistadors, and etc., and question what is the ideology behind those myths. There are problems with conceiving the so-called discovery of the Americas as an exceptional historical event. Portrayals of Columbus as a visionary, someone with a brilliant use of the technologies of the age, are more telling about the time and culture in which they are produced than about Columbus and his time themselves. The most exceptional thing about Columbus's geographical vision was that it was profoundly wrong. His achievements were, in short, the result of historical accident. The mythologization of the man, the great man's approach, ignores the roles played by larger processes of social change. It ignores the context and the many other expert mariners and scientists around that same period. The Columbus myth is also a myth of origins, a foundational myth, which is even more problematic. To present Columbus as a founding father for the Americas, a symbol of the nation, a legend of the European arrival at the height of the Renaissance, is very problematic. Traditional school curriculum and films, media, and popular culture present this historical figure as taken out of a 19th century nation-building tradition. They present Columbus, as in the portraits and the films that we have on the screen, they present Columbus as a romantic character, a man of sciences, a visionary, a humanist, but also as a modern self-made man, an individualist, an immigrant, the symbol of the American nation, the one who brought democracy to this land, and also the one who started capitalism and trade with the Americas. The problem is that all these characterizations avoid the representation of what the historical figure really was: a merchant, a mercenary, a rather common and simple navigator, like many other Florentine, Irish, Portuguese, and Spaniards of the time. And perhaps more importantly, this 19th century characterization of Christopher Columbus avoids the correct assessment of his figure as the founder of modern colonialism in the Americas, as the first transatlantic slave trader, and as the initiator of the devastation of some of the indigenous populations in the Caribbean. A more historically informed assessment of the historical figure of Christopher Columbus should have portrayed him as a man of his time and not ahead of his time. Columbus was not alone, and his vision that sailing west he could reach Asia, the battle for the Atlantic exploration had begun in earnest at least 200 years before his first journey. The Vivaldi brothers set off from Genoa in 1291 for what turned out to be a one-way voyage. But in the 1450s and 1460s, many islands of the Atlantic coast of Africa were explored and placed in the map, such as Madeira, Azores, or the Canary Islands. Most of the Atlantic was already well-traveled, and Portugal was leading the explorations. So in sum, his discoveries were an accident, a geographical accident, a byproduct of Portuguese maritime expansions 2 centuries before, and the Portuguese and Castilian competition for Atlantic control 1 century old, and for competition over the sea route to India at least as old as Marco Polo. Had Columbus not reached the Bahamas on that October 12th, and had he not sent back to Spain the first letter announcing the new lands, any other navigator would have done so in a matter of days, or at the most, a couple of months. Thank you.
I should have, oh yeah, here we go. Great. Thanks, Benita. Thanks, Mario and Phil. Thank you, everyone, for inviting me. Always Athleen, who's the rock. Is this right up there? Okay, great. So, and thanks to students, especially my own students. It's great to see you. And a shout out to my colleague, Stan Pugliese in particular, who does a lot of the work that I'll be talking about, who has uncovered a lot of the history that I will make reference to, and who can correct any errors of mine. Okay, so why not Columbus? So Columbus, as we've heard, was a flesh and blood figure, but he's also really important as a symbol, and not just an Italian-American symbol, because his symbolic importance actually predates his importance to the Italian-American community. So you see up on the screen Britannia, right? That's the female symbol of Britain, of the British Empire. Can you see her? What happened? Oh, there she is. Okay. We also see Marianne, who I share a name with, who is the female symbol, the embodiment of France, and this is a revolutionary figure here. And then there is Columbia, 1804. And Columbia is the feminized version of Columbus, but so here's what happens, right? Usually when we have women, up until very recently in human history, when we have representations that include women, they're allegorical, they're not real. They're symbols. So Columbus, we take the us off, we put the IA on, we feminize Columbus into Columbia, and then as a feminized symbol, that symbol becomes the embodiment of America. And that's what it was intended as, not as the US, but as America, right? I'm using that term deliberately. And then here's another one I found, which is really interesting. This is Thomas Nast, who is a famous cartoonist. This is for Harper's, and it's Uncle Sam's Thanksgiving Dinner, 19th century. Columbus is the guy on the right carving the turkey. And I'm sorry, Uncle Sam is the guy on the right carving the turkey, and Columbia is the woman on the left seated who is hosting the guests, and they're immigrants and people and indigenous people from immigrants from all over the world. The idea is everybody's welcome here. We know that's not true, but that was the idea. So before Lady Liberty, there was Columbia, and a feminized allegory like Britannia and Marianne, the French symbol. And there also was a song. My poor students had to hear this the other day. You may have recognized the melody, Columbia, the gem of the ocean. And that was the unofficial anthem of the US before the Star-Spangled Banner. So this symbol, this feminized Columbus, who becomes the symbol of America, is really important even before Columbus himself as an historical figure comes to be associated with Italian immigrants and Italian Americans. And it really, one of the things that Dr. Sampedro talked about, and that will probably come up later, though maybe not quite in this way, it really all kind of hinges on the rhetoric of arrival, right? This notion that arrival, the story of arrival, is central to identity. So the Columbus was the first, I'm just using that for the sake of argument, the first to arrive here. Therefore, he gets the honor of being the symbolic embodiment of the place where he arrived. And if you've ever come across people who trace their lineage back to the Mayflower, members of the Sons and Daughters of the Revolution, the prestige in that is that you arrived a long time ago. And even as we're debating now about Columbus, what we say is you didn't arrive here before the people you encountered when you were here. They got here first, right? And even if we think about the 1619 project, what is 1619? Right, that is a year of arrival. So rhetorics of arrival are really important to the construction of collective identity. And Columbus offers a way for groups who feel excluded from that to gain entree. And the first group of immigrants who really exploit Columbus as a way of kind of getting a piece of that, so to speak, are Catholics generally, but primarily Irish Catholic immigrants. So in 1882, an Irish Catholic priest founds what is an organization that still exists and is still very active that is known as the Knights of Columbus. This is an organization that does charity work, particularly for immigrants, Catholic immigrants, who lost a breadwinner. So you no longer have somebody who can work for your family's income, so we will help provide for you. And this is really important because in 1882, the US was an even more unkind place to working people than it is now. There had not yet been a New Deal, so there was no unemployment insurance, no workers' compensation. So the kind of work that the Knights of Columbus and other immigrant fraternal organizations, and certainly Catholics were not the only ones who had these organizations, was really essential to survival in a hostile environment. And as you can tell, the language Knights of Columbus has an association with the Crusades, with the vanquishing, right, of the infidels by the good people, supposedly by the Catholics, the Christians, and the age of exploration. So they are Knights of Columbus. And not surprisingly, Italian immigrants want a piece of that, right? So why? Why would they feel a need to claim a piece of this kind of rhetoric of arrival, this symbolism of America? There were always Italians in the U.S., right? There was even an William Paca signed the Declaration of Independence. Right? So it's not like Italians weren't here, but it really wasn't until towards the end of the 19th century that they started coming in really, really, really significant numbers. They came mostly from the South, and they were, many of them, most of them are rural people who did not possess the skills for work in an industrial economy, though they soon learned them. They spoke what many people believed to be a weird language. They had what many people believed to be weird religious customs, including other Catholics. Irish Catholics would often look down upon and scorn the religious traditions of their fellow Catholics. There are even instances of Irish Catholic parishes making their Italian worshipers worship in the basement so they didn't sully the pews. They had a high level of illiteracy. In fact, Italian immigrants had among the highest levels of illiteracy of any immigrant group, particularly the women. They also had high rates of return. Right? So they weren't coming here, in contrast to some of the stories that you might hear. They weren't all coming here because they wanted to contribute to the project of building a nation. Right? We often hear this distinction between immigrants who come now, they just want to make money, and our ancestors who came because they really believed in the project of building America. Well, Italians migrated all over the world. You can find them everywhere. And they came here, in part, many of them, in fact, a majority of them came to make some money and then go back home where they really wanted to be. So that high rate of return made them suspect in the eyes of people who were already here. And also there was this sense they were legally recognized as white because they were European, but popularly recognized as not so much. Because they tended to come from the South. They tended to be at least seen as more swarthy and closer to black than white. There's a term that was coined, in between people, to refer to Italians as really not occupying a really stable place in the racial hierarchy here. They were white, but not quite comfortably white, and they were popularly thought of as black, but not legally. So they had this kind of really tenuous position for a lot of different reasons. But the thing that really kind of launches the association of Italians and Columbus happens in 1891 in New Orleans, when 11 Italian immigrants, and we'll call them Italian Americans, were lynched. They were lynched because they had allegedly killed the chief of police, Hennessy, in New Orleans. And it is the largest single lynching in the South. Stan, you can correct me, in the U.S., I think. And upon taking his last breath, Hennessy's supposed last words were, "The Dagos did it." And so that riled up the good citizens of New Orleans, and they lynched 11 Italians in retribution for this crime. And this was, I do not mean to suggest that lynching was something characteristic of the Italian immigrant experience. It wasn't. But this happened. This is a fact. Blacks in the U.S. were lynched at far greater numbers than any other group. But again, this happened in 1891. And people were really upset about it, and there was some worry that there might be retribution. The Italian Navy was pretty considerable at the time. And so there was talk at the highest levels of the US government, well, we really kind of need to do something. Popularly, this was considered a really good thing. There were positive reports of this in the New York Times and other publications, respected publications of the day. This will teach that mob of Dagos that they need to respect the law. Who do they think they are, kind of stuff. But there also was concern that this could really, this could have negative repercussions. So President William Henry Harrison uses his office to come up with a way to acknowledge the contributions of Italians to the US as a way to say, okay, we actually think you're valuable people. And it was 1892 when this actually came to pass, and so 1492, 1892, okay, Columbus, right? The occasion of 1892, an anniversary of 1492 seems like a good occasion to use Columbus as the figure who represents the achievements of Italians in the so-called New World. Columbus Day is celebrated. It's a really big deal, but it's supposed to be a one-shot deal, kind of here, we do think you're okay kind of thing. Now go home and be good. And so it turned out not to be a one-shot deal. Columbus turned out to be very appealing to the Italian immigrant community. He represented for them a way to belong. He was European, he was white. He was here before the WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. If that's a term that doesn't resonate with you, it absolutely did in the late 19th, early 20th century. These are the people who held the reins of power in just about every sphere of influence in the US. And Columbus became a big deal in the US. And he wasn't and isn't a big deal elsewhere, in part because Italian immigrants had different experiences elsewhere. They had, in many ways, a horrific experience here that they didn't have in other places. And so they glommed onto Columbus as kind of a way to insinuate themselves into this narrative of arrival and belonging and Americanness. So the class of professionals, we would call them petty bourgeois, perhaps, but in Italian they were called the prominenti, right? The prominent ones, bankers, lawyers, politicians. They really promoted Columbus to ordinary Italian immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in large part because they wanted to enhance their own status. If Italian immigrants don't look so terrible in everybody else's eyes, then neither do they. So he becomes important to the community. Immigrant workers, dip into their pockets. These are poor people, right? They dip into their pockets to send money, to fund statues, and they participate in celebrations because they think, look, it's really hard to be here in general, and it's hard in particular for Italian immigrants, and it was harder for others, but from their subjective experience, it's really hard to be us, and it was. So, if this is going to help, I'm all about it. And so they did. And so Columbus is an important, but he's also a contested figure in the Italian immigrant community as well. In the 1920s and 30s, you've got Italian radicals, the sovversivi, in contrast to the prominenti, right? Who are really, who are not really interested in becoming fully assimilated to a middle class kind of a comfortable middle-class American way of life. They're really challenging the very idea. And Columbus emerges as a place, the day and the statues, as a place of struggle. I mean, literally, like people beating each other up in front of Columbus monuments. And I just want to call your attention to something really interesting that happens that kind of complicates the story in 1935. Mussolini, the fascist Mussolini and his fascist regime invade Ethiopia on October 3rd. Later in the month, you've got Italian radicals saying, okay, and Mussolini, by the way, did a lot to encourage Italian immigrants in the US to be pro-fascist. He worked really diligently to cultivate in them a sense of Italianità, which means Italianness, and to be proud. And that was really compelling to a lot of immigrants. But here, finally, we got a guy, right, who is on the world stage along with everybody else. Now, lest you mock them, right, there were lots of Americans, most Americans, in high places who agreed. And in part, they agreed because Mussolini cut a very dashing figure, but also they agreed in part because they said, yeah, these Italians, like, they're really rowdy and hyper-emotional, and if this strong man can get them under control, he's okay with us. The other reason why Mussolini was really well-liked is he doesn't like communists, anarchists, and socialists, so he can't be all that bad. But of course, he was all that bad. And in October of 1935, later in the month, around the day we are contesting as Columbus Day, a call went out from Italians, radicals, Italian workers, and all workers of every ethnicity and race, black and white, to meet at the Columbus statue and to declare that Columbus Day did not belong to the fascists, and to declare that Mussolini had made a mistake, in fact, had done a terrible thing to invade Ethiopia. So ponder the irony of that. You've got a call to workers of the world, black, white, and everything else, unite. Columbus belongs to us, not to the fascists. And we will fight him for invading our Africa. We will fight along with our African and African-American brothers and sisters and all races and ethnicities so that he cannot claim Columbus, because if Mussolini claims Columbus, then he claims America. And America belongs not to the fascists, but to us. So this history, I think, makes Columbus a little bit different than other currently contested sculptures like Confederate generals and the like, right? Columbus is a rallying point for a feared and a scorned, and in some cases, a hated and oppressed ethnic group. That doesn't make it right now, okay? But it does, I think, suggest that the story is a little complicated. And for the last 40 or so, as Professor Murillo said, plus years, Columbus Day and Columbus statues are sites of struggle, once again. And the actual officially declared Columbus Day holiday is not linked legally to Italian Americans, right? That's something that they have taken on themselves. But Italian, and they're loyal to him, and to this day. They perceive criticism of Columbus as criticism of Italian Americans, and they go to great pains to save Columbus Day. You may see the bumper stickers, you may see them march, you may see them carry banners. Some of them are my friends, and some of them are my cousins. But I would submit to you that it's not really a good idea to base your identity on a single historic figure. And Professor Sampedro raised a lot of questions, I think, when this was one of them, right? The great man, or I would submit the great woman. The fact is, Columbus is problematic, even for Italian Americans who want their heritage respected. He didn't discover America, as we heard. He was probably not the first European here. There's also the sense that St. Brendan the Navigator, an Irish monk, might have come here, Leif Erikson, right? So he probably wasn't even first. He sailed from Geneva, not Italy. Italy didn't exist in 1492, so he technically wasn't even Italian. And he was not revered in Italy. There's like a kind of like a cheesy, not even, there's like a sculpture of him in a rundown park in Geneva. There's a rundown sculpture, nobody even knows it's there. But to the best of my knowledge, south of Rome, there are no sculptures of Columbus. He's just not that big of a deal in Italy. And he's certainly not an Italian American. And he's called the first Italian American by Italian Americans who want to preserve this legacy. But the US didn't exist when he landed. He didn't come here anyway. He wasn't Italian, he wasn't American. So when protectors of Columbus statues and Columbus Day claim he's the first Italian American and that if he didn't come here, you wouldn't be here either, and they do claim that, they're wrong. Also, Columbus has nothing, almost nothing in common with the people who actually did come here from Italy. They were, I should say we were poor people for the most part. We were hardworking people for the most part. We were rag pickers, factory workers, coal miners. The men in my family were all coal miners. The women were all garment workers in factories. We were agricultural workers, often recruited to work in plantations where black workers were told, you know, we're going to bring these people down because they'll make even better Negroes than you will, right? So it's a really, really complex history. And they were politically diverse. They were anarchists, they were socialists, they were communists, they were liberals, they were fascists, they were apolitical. And my work and Stan Pugliese's work and a lot of other people's work has really tried to bring this nuanced history to light. They were disliked, they were misunderstood, and they were mocked. But that doesn't mean Columbus should be their symbol. There are many proposals right now for alternative historical figures to represent the Italian-American experience. Angela Bombace, who was a garment worker, organizer, and leader. Mother Cabrini, who did extraordinary work with immigrant communities. Sacco and Vanzetti, Italian immigrant anarchists executed. Pete Cacchione, who you probably never heard of, but who was the first communist elected to the New York City Council and was an extraordinary, what we would call today, anti-racist advocate, absolutely incredible. But the question that I pose is, can really any one person represent a whole ethnic group? I think that the individuality of all of these people limits them and excludes them from consideration. I don't think we should have one person to represent an ethnic group whose experiences are so multiple. So I think it's time to let it go. But I will plug, as a director of labor studies, if we let it go, and I embrace the idea of Indigenous Peoples Day, let's not let the paid holiday go. Working people in the US don't get enough paid holiday. So if you're advocating for the end of Columbus Day, please don't advocate for the end of a paid holiday for working people. And so what I would say in closing is, rather than pretend to victimization in the present, which is what I think a lot of Italian American leaders do, I think Italian Americans should use their very real history of exploitation and oppression. And again, this is real, right? This isn't like people trying to pretend so that they can gain the spotlight. I mean, this is a real history of exploitation. But rather than pretend it still exists, it doesn't. Let's use it to fight against the very real exploitation and discrimination that continues against Indigenous people and other immigrant groups and working people of all sorts today, right now. Rather than promote ourselves at everybody else's expense, let's work to lift everybody up together. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Marianne, and thank you, Benita. So if you want to come up here, maybe we can bring up this. We have about 10 minutes for Q&A. Maybe we can bring up the screen and open it up. I want to welcome two students, student fellows from the Center for Civic Engagement. Alex Attili, who's a political science major and a Spanish and Latin American Caribbean Studies minor, and a fellow at CCE at the Center for Civic Engagement, and Damali Ramirez, who is a journalism and political science double major and a civic engagement minor, also a fellow at the CCE. So why don't all of us come up, and we'll have about 10 minutes to engage in Q&A with everybody. So come on up. I guess go up there. Just while they're going up, I just wanted to announce and preview. No, you don't want to go up, or you're going to stay there? Or we can stay on the floor, maybe, if it's more comfortable. A few sessions. The one that's coming up at around 2:40, and unfortunately, there's two of our sessions that are not going to be face-to-face. At 2:40, we have a keynote presentation with Joseph Pierce of the Cherokee Nation. His talk is going to be Kinship with Stars, Cherokee Stories of Celestial Relation. It should be very strong. And at 4:20, we're going to have another session virtually via Zoom, In the Name of God, Christian Boarding Schools and the Systematic Genocide of Indigenous Children in North America. So that's coming up at 4:20. So I'll throw it to the two of you, Damali and Alex.
Thank you. Is this on?
Yes.
Okay. Dr. Sampedro, during your chat, you talked about historical inaccuracies. I guess one of the questions I wanted to ask is, how can we counter, the misinformation and the historical inaccuracy that has been long portrayed throughout history?
Well, I guess that is the challenge, right? But I think, as I began to mention before in the presentation, there are linguistic issues that we need to address to refer, to the very period itself, and that should be the first step. There are chronological issues as well, right? Think of having 1492, right, as this marker, right? The problem of when the historical narratives begin and whose narratives do we privilege with this, right? 1492 means a different thing, probably, for us in our curriculum and academic system and tradition of the West than it may mean for many other cultures and civilizations of the Americas back and then, right, and now. So different indigenous communities in the Americas record events, right, and mark their beginnings at different stages which don't go on pace with the European narrative. Let's say, for instance, right, the Inca Empire, one of the biggest empires in the Americas at the time of these transatlantic travels. Huayna Capac, one of the last leaders, Inca, of the Inca Empire, an empire that expanded all the way from Colombia to Chile, came to power in 1493, and he consolidated and expanded the empire until 1525. So for Inca history, or for the histories of all these countries that today fall under the geographical parameters of what used to be the Inca Empire, there is a different chronology here that does not necessarily align with 1492, this beginning and this after, right? Another example, like close by, will be the Mexican Empire, right? The Aztec Empire. Moctezuma II was ruling from 1502 to 1520, right? The defeat of Tenochtitlan. And during his rule of the Aztec Empire, the Mexicas, right? He expanded the empire all the way to what is most of Texas today and Central America, and he ruled over about 5 million people at the time. So it was an empire at its height, right? So when we are telling the narrative of these communities, or if you tell the narrative from a different point of view, this 1492 before and after does not fall in line, right? And just to give one last example, that is not an imperial history, right? Let's say for indigenous communities in the south of Chile, for the Mapuche, right, in the Chilean Patagonia, they resisted early stages of colonization in the 17th century, and their story of beginnings, kind of, right, begins in the mid-19th century when European migrants arriving to Chile, German, Italian, Spanish, and so on, right, enter their lands, and the conquest of this territory actually happens. So again, it is the way we think of history, the way we tell history, and what are our historical markers, also our linguistic, right, conceptualizations of this history that we need to kind of revisit.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Tarsiati. So how do you think that Italian Americans can retain their sense of self, identity, and culture while also acknowledging and foregoing the legacy of Columbus?
Oh my gosh, how does everybody else do it? I mean, food, history, art, music, travel to Italy. You know, there are numerous other ways besides an attachment to an historical figure who largely is disconnected from the experiences of their forebears. Like, I don't know. I know a lot of Italians and Italian Americans. Nobody's a Genovese explorer. So that's yeah. I mean, I'm working, and I'll leave it here. Like, I've spent the last 10 years of my life working on a memorial for women who worked in a garment factory in New York. Everything in this room that protects us from fire and other disasters is a consequence of what happened in that fire. And a third of them were Italian immigrants. We could, let's glom onto labor history, for example. We were extraordinary radicals. I mean, you know, the current conception is that we're very conservative and right-wing, and ooh, baby, that's not true, but it's also historically not true either. We led some of the most incredible movements, strike movements, free speech movements. So let's just expand our sense of what counts as history.
we're almost running out of time. We do have Common Hour coming up next, so if you have more questions, I think we could probably take a couple more before we wrap up. So, Damali?
Yeah, so I guess I'll ask one I think that the public is thinking about right now, but, you know, it's for either one of you guys. How can we continue the dialogue of talking about, like, Native American social injustice, you know, outside of just Indigenous Peoples Day?
Is that?
Yeah, for either
Oh,
one.
that's for
Yeah.
either of us?
Yeah.
You know, I think that's the question about just about any campaign for human rights or for labor rights or for is how do you get people engaged, right? Right now in the age of the internet, it's not that we don't have the information. We know it's happening. We really struggle to get people's attention. And I like this. I think educational events, and I think perhaps dialogue like what we're having today between Italian Americans and Indigenous people. And yeah, I mean, that's the challenge, not just for this, though, but I think for everything, is how do you break through that wall and get the attention of people for whom a million things are clamoring for their attention right now. Because there's a lot of great work going on with the Shinnecock people out east, too, on Long Island, and just making people aware of it. I mean, I would put it like, what do you think?
Like, do you want to answer that, Alex?
Oh gosh.
Well, there is a lot of action going on. Right now, there's a 5-day mobilization. I forget how they called it. I have it written down here somewhere. Basically going to the White House, doing civil disobedience. It's called the 5-Day People versus Fossil Fuels Mobilization, and it's spearheaded by a coalition of indigenous groups from North America who are drawing attention to the lack of action on fossil fuels and on you know, cutting fossil fuels once and for all. There's a lot of stuff going on. Just a matter of, like Dr. Trasiati said, following it, paying attention to it, and joining those forces when you see that you can play a role in it. Well, I learned a hell of a lot, so I really appreciate Marianne and Benita for joining us. And I encourage you all to get involved with Center for Civic Engagement. Try to attend some of the sessions that we have lined up for the rest of the day. And thank you, Phil, again, for taking this on. And have a great rest of the Indigenous Peoples Day. Thank you so much.